Well, these are the words from the Gospel of Mark, the 5th chapter, starting with the 21st verse, and then skipping over a bit. Jesus went back across the other side of the lake. There at the lake side, a large crowd gathered around him. Jairus, an official of the local synagogue, came up, and when he saw Jesus, he threw himself down at his feet and begged him as hard as he could, "My little daughter is very sick. Please come and place your hands on her so that she will get well and live." Then Jesus started off with him. So many people were going along with him that there was crowding around him on every side. And then starting with the 35th verse. While Jesus was saying these things, some messengers came from Jairus' house and told him, "Your daughter has died. Why should you bother the teacher any longer?" Jesus paid no attention to what they said, but told him, "Don't be afraid, only believe." Then he did not let anyone go on with him except Peter and James and his brother John. They arrived at the official's house, where Jesus saw the confusion and heard all the loud crying and moaning and wailing. He went in and said to them, "Why all this confusion? Why are you crying? The child is not dead, she is only sleeping." They all started making fun of him and his 3 disciples and went into the room where the child was laying. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Tabitha Kanamum," which means, "Little girl, get up." "I tell you," he says to her. She got up at once and started walking around. She was 12 years old. When this happened, they were completely amazed, but Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone and said, "Give her something to eat." Now, during my junior year in college at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, I had the opportunity to fill in for 2 little churches. One was the Elo Methodist Church, which was in Pickett on highway, I think it was 44 or 26, heading toward Ripon. And the other little church, they were about to close. There were only a couple of people worshiping, apparently, and it was in Rosendale. And so I went, and I said, "Do you mind if I go to Rosendale?" "Well, there won't hardly be anybody there." Well, there were a couple of people. I said, "Look, we've got to get this church going." And we got it going, which was wonderful. And before I left, there were 75 people in that church, and it was just a wonderful group of folks. And I was there for 5 years at Pickett, the 2 Methodist churches. And 2 events occurred, one in each of the churches, that I will never, ever forget. One of the events was a relatively new young couple with a small 6-year-old child who joined the Elo, the Pickett Church. And shortly after they joined, he was diagnosed with advanced leukemia. The little guy just withered away and ended up in the hospital for quite a long stay. And I went to the hospital frequently and happened to be there the very day he died. I can tell you the desperation on the parents' face was etched in sorrow and sadness and tears. And it was clear that they were feeling so desperate that this child that they loved had now died. They were just beside themselves in desperation. The other event that occurred happened at the Rosendale Church, and one evening I received a phone call from a mother who, in great tears and anguish, is telling me that her daughter had been killed that evening in an automobile accident. Across the lines of the telephone, I could tell her desperation, her anguish, her questions, her whys, how comes, what do we do next? Oh, what a terrible loss. I don't think I'll ever forget those. And it's led me to believe that we need to pay attention to people, both in their joy and in their anguish and pain, sorrow, and in their desperation. Desperation. That was what described both of those events for those families. Now, if you think a bit, think about the desperate situations across the globe. People who find themselves in horrible situations. Think of the mothers and fathers who are trying to save their nation in Ukraine. The mothers and fathers who are concerned about whether the next missile strike will hit their apartment, their house, their village, their community, whether the next mortar will kill their father, whether the nurses and doctors who are caring for people in hospitals are worried whether their hospitals will be hit, or those who are wondering in the places where the elderly are being cared for, and those who are disabled, whether they too will be safe. It is that desperation that has, I think, caught our attention in a very special way, because this is a nation that was a democratic republic. It was a nation that at least was striving to be a free and strong nation by itself, who found itself attacked and now in desperation is fighting back. I think of those who have been struck by tsunamis and tornadoes, and those who have been hit by horrible natural disasters, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions, as they think about how they're going to save themselves as the event is coming down upon them. In desperation, they flee, leaving everything that they have and returning oftentimes to find nothing. I think of the desperation that many people who are really struggling to do well all across the globe, who are hungry because of civil and religious conflict in Sudan, in Darfur, score of other places across the globe. I think of the mothers who see their children being abused and beaten and sometimes kidnapped, either to be child warriors in the Congo and other places across Africa, or who decide that they're going to risk their bodies and risk their lives and make every effort to find freedom. Think about their desperation. Now, perhaps the desperation of Jairus is an excellent example of what many of us feel when tragedy strikes. Here is a man who comes. He's a Jew. He's part of the synagogue. He's an official. Maybe he is the administrative assistant, or maybe he's the trustee, or maybe he is the president of the synagogue. I don't know what official means, but he had some position of responsibility. And he has a daughter who is dying. I suspect he's tried everything. I suspect he's gone to the shamans. I suspect he's gone to those who claim they can heal. They've gone to those who said they were doctors. My hunch is he prayed mightily. And then he decided to come and find Jesus. To find Jesus. And so he comes to Jesus, and it's clear that he is desperate. He comes and he falls on his knees and he begs Jesus, "My daughter is ill. Come and touch her so that she might be well." Now, that section of the scripture that I didn't read is the time then that in the midst of this crowd, a woman who is bleeding to death comes, and she believes that if she can just reach out and touch him, she could be healed. And can you imagine Jairus saying, "Hey, wait a minute, I got him, he's mine. Don't go fooling around with Jesus. I got to get him over to my house. My daughter is dying. This is desperate. I need him." Jesus stops. Who touched me, he says. And the crowd and the disciples almost mock him. There's a crowd, Jesus, they say. Of course you're being touched. And Jesus knows that the touch is different. He turns around and says, who touched me? And the woman comes to him and says, I did. I did. And I am now whole. And he says, your faith has made you well. Then on again to the man's house after he hears that the daughter is dead, and people mock Jesus again because he's going to a place where nobody can help this little girl. She's dead. They can prepare for her funeral. But no, he goes. And he tells them not to be anxious and afraid and worried. Believe, believe. And then he goes, touches the little girl. She comes awake and gets up and is moving about as a 12-year-old would move about. And he says to the family, get her something to eat. It's such a simple story. And it reminds us that sometimes our religion becomes so complex and so confined to rigidity that we fail to recognize that the simplest things sometimes are what get Jesus' attention. It's Jairus who comes to Jesus, gets on his knees and says, help me. Jesus doesn't say anything. He doesn't ask him if he's going to be converted first. He doesn't ask him if he's going to pledge allegiance to Jesus. He doesn't ask him to say certain words that will prove that he is a man of faith. His very actions demonstrate that he's a person of faith. And the woman who comes to Jesus, all she wants to do is touch him. She has such incredible belief and she is in such desperation. She's willing to try anything and press herself, as weak as she likely is, hemorrhaging as she is. She finds a way to reach through the crowd and touch his garment. And she's healed. Now, it's a mystery to me. But it's a wonderful mystery because it demonstrates that Jesus understands the nature of life in a way that we don't fully understand. And yet at the same time, it's a way for us to understand that Jesus says there are lots of bleeding that goes on in the world. Heal it for God's sake. Heal the bleeding, the bitterness, the anger, the hatred. Heal it. And heal it in my name. Come to me, if you will, on your knees and beg me. I will be with you anyway, and I will help you find a way to heal the pain and the suffering that goes on in the world. If you want to renew life, if you want to give life to people, find a way to end the hatred and the bitterness and the division wherever it may exist. Wherever it may exist. So I'm saying to you something I don't think I've ever said before. I'm grateful for Paul and for Paul's incredible witness in the New Testament. And I know that sometimes Paul, who was himself a Pharisee, by the way, who was trained in the very best school to be a Pharisee, he understood the law of God from the Jewish point of view. And I think he took some of that rigidity and that orthodoxy into his following of Jesus. And so some folks want us to say certain words to prove that we are, in fact, disciples of Jesus. They want us to say certain phrases that will demonstrate that we fully understand who Jesus is. And none of that was asked by Jesus. None of that. Come, touch my daughter. She's sick. You can make her well. How much more faith do you need? Do you need more words? Do we need to have affirmations that have the right words in them? I don't think so. And the woman who is bleeding to death, who knows that she doesn't have much time left, she will die. And she reaches through the crowd and touches Jesus' garment. How much more faith do you need? And those who would mock Jesus, including his disciples, learned a lesson that day, that in Jesus all things were possible. That is to say, Jesus gave new reality to their old reality. He gave new insight to their old understanding. He gave a new way of understanding God's love for God's creation. What more do you need? What he said was, believe, believe, believe. Amen.